When I was first introduced into college football, I was a big fan of Tavon Austin and DeAnthony Thomas. And I remember back in elementary school at lunch, we used to have some really heated debates about who was better, Tavon Austin and DeAnthony Thomas. Like those Tavon and DeAnthony Thomas debates used to go crazy. And these were two of the most electrifying players in college football during the 2010s. And when both of these guys came into the NFL, there is a lot of hype behind these two players, right? And ultimately, neither one was able to have the same amount of success in the National Football League that they had on the collegiate level. And I feel like the reason why neither one of these players worked out isn't because they weren't talented enough. I just think that the NFL wasn't really ready for players like Tavon Austin and DeAnthony Thomas that had their kind of skill sets, because both of these dudes are really undersized. Tavon is 5'8", 174 pounds when he came out, and similar to DeAnthony Thomas only had an inch in height over him at 5'9", 174 pounds. And another thing is that they more were positionless players than they were being true wide receivers or being true running backs. They were players that you had to move around the offense. And I don't think that during the time when they came into the NFL, there was the same amount of creativity then than there is right now. Imagine if Tavon Austin got drafted in last year's NFL draft by the Miami Dolphins, and he had an offensive mind like Mike McDaniel, who was able to find ways to get the most out of Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill because all the motion that he utilizes in his offense, the fact that Mike McDaniels does such a great job at getting Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle in space. That's something that I don't think Tavon Austin really had the luxury of having, even though he did have Sean McVay as his head coach at one point when he got hired by the Rams. It's just Sean McVay didn't really know how to work with a player that had Tavon Austin's skill set. And Andy Reid was coaching DeAnthony Thomas in Kansas City at one point, but even he didn't really know how to use a guy like DeAnthony Thomas. You see, these guys were great in space. They were players that you had to get involved using motion, bubble screens, sweeps, slants. Despite the fact that they had game-changing speed, they weren't phenomenal deep threats. They weren't really great catching the ball in the middle with defensives laying down big hits on them. They were guys that you had to get involved on the perimeter. They were limited to either being in the slot or being more seen as a gadget running back. And there just wasn't a lot of creativity in the NFL at that time when it came to finding out ways to use undersized players like Tavon Austin and DeAnthony Thomas. I think that in the year 2023 now, the league is more suited for players that have the kind of skill sets that Tavon and DeAnthony Thomas had. It's just that back then, the NFL just wasn't ready for them. And I think in the current state that the game is in right now, it's moving more towards of having smaller players that are undersized but really shifty in the open field. Look at, Tank Dell, for example, and Zay Flowers. Neither one of those guys are physically imposing. Tank Dell is 5'8", and Zay Flowers is 5'9". But despite that, they're really good with the respective teams because they know how to get open. They're fantastic route runners. Tavon Austin and DeAnthony Thomas weren't really great route runners. You kind of had to manufacture ways for them to get open in a sense, and that's a big reason why they weren't all that effective at the NFL level. If you put Tavon Austin or DeAnthony Thomas when they first came out in the offense that the Dolphins run, I think they have way more success than what they did early on in their careers when they first got drafted. It's just that the game has changed so much, and there's just so much more creativity on the offense now that it will vote well for guys like Tavon and DeAnthony Thomas. And I just think that, they came into the NFL at a time where the game didn't know how to use players that had this skill set. And I feel like they were before their time. Now, there's other reasons why they weren't really that great. Tavon Austin was more of a gadget player. He was able to make the most out of his collegiate career when he was a two-time All-American because he was just so elusive, and he also had game-breaking speed. But once you get to the NFL, you got to be able to get open. And Tavon Austin wasn't really great at separating. He didn't run the greatest routes. And he also wasn't really a great deep threat that had reliable hands. Meanwhile, you look at DeAnthony Thomas, he was more just so a special teams player who maybe at times he could give you a spark on offense. But I don't even think Andy Reid was all that great finding out ways to get DeAnthony Thomas involved. So it's not like these players didn't have the skill set to be as good in the NFL as they were in college. In my opinion, I just think that the league at that time when they came in just didn't know how to utilize these guys with the special skill sets that they had compared to the current present day in the NFL. If Tavon Austin and Anthony Thomas came out of the last two drafts, I feel like they would have had way more success because the NFL is more geared towards smaller players that have this skill set than what it was a decade ago in 2013 and 2014. So you guys let me know how you guys feel about Tavon Austin, DeAnthony Thomas, and give your reasons for why you feel they didn't work in the league. And do you agree with my take? Do you feel like these two guys were drafted before their time? Do you feel like the NFL didn't know how to utilize their skill sets back when they first were introduced into the league? Because I feel like in the year 2023, you put either one of these guys coming out on a Mike McDaniel's offense or a Kyle Shanahan offense, and they will go to work.